It all started on a seemingly ordinary Sunday in August. I was 15, enjoying carefree school days, and that weekend my family and I visited my father's construction site, located near a peaceful lake. We spent the day by the water, basking in the sun's warmth, oblivious to the dark shadow that was about to cast itself over my life. That night we had dinner outside, laughing, unaware of the nightmare that was already beginning. The next morning I woke with a fever, one that burned hotter with each passing day. At first we thought it was nothing serious, just a flu maybe. But the fever didn't break. For days it clung to me like something alive, like it was waiting for nightfall. By dusk each day the fever would spike, unbearable heat surging through my body. By midnight it felt as though I was on fire, my legs racked with excruciating pain. Medicines were useless, the doctors found nothing, and every test came back normal. But I was wasting away. 2 weeks passed and the strange occurrences began. One night, as I lay in a feverish sleep, my mother rushed to my room when she heard me crying. But when she entered, something was wrong, something that chilled her to her core. I was talking in my sleep, but the words coming out of my mouth weren't mine. I was speaking in Kannada, a language I had never known. Terrified, my parents didn't know what to do. Night after night I would mutter and scream in this strange tongue, my body burning with fever, my voice no longer my own. It was the house's watchman, an old man who had lived in the area for years, who finally recognized what I was saying. His face went pale when he translated. A woman's voice speaking through me, crying out for help. The spirit was that of a woman who had been brutally murdered by her husband. She and her daughter had been buried in the very place where my father's construction was taking place. The woman pleaded, saying she needed a proper burial. Her body and her daughter's bones needed to be found and given the last rites. Until then, she would have no peace, and neither would I. My father, horrified by the revelation, promised to do everything she asked. The fever that had gripped me began to lift, but the fear never left. I refused to stay alone, afraid of what might happen next. Days passed, and my father, caught up in the demands of his work, forgot his promise. The spirit, however, did not. One day, on my way home from school, I was in a minor accident, a warning, a reminder of the spirit's unfinished business. That night she returned, not with pleading words, but with fury. This time the presence felt malevolent, darker, more dangerous. Terrified, my father and the watchman rushed to the site, determined to fulfill her wishes. They dug deep into the earth, and just as she had said, they found bones, her skeleton and that of her child. They performed the last rites, giving her and her daughter the proper rituals and offerings they had been denied in life. As they completed the ceremonies, I felt an overwhelming sense of release, as though a weight had been lifted from me. When they returned home, the spirit spoke one final time, her voice soft but clear, thanking them for setting her free. From that moment on, the fever and the haunting stopped. I never remembered any of the nights when the spirit spoke through me. But my parents told me everything. We still honor her memory each year, giving offerings to young girls in need, a tradition that has become a part of our lives. The spirit never wanted to harm me. She was simply searching for peace, and now she has it. When I first moved into the house, it seemed cheerful, almost too perfect. 7 adults and 1 little girl, Abigail. She was quiet for her age, with long corn silk, blonde hair, and eyes that seemed far too deep for a child. I thought of her as a little doll, often holding her in my lap, but something about her unsettled me. Her need to always be touching someone, gripping a pant leg or skirt. She never wanted to be alone. I spoke to her older brother, Henry, about her odd behavior. and what he told me turned my stomach. Abigail had suffered unspeakable abuse at the hands of her estranged brother, sent away to live with their father. From that moment I began to notice the way she watched us. Her big, empty eyes seemed to devour every glance, every touch between Henry and me. As Henry and I grew closer, her jealousy became more obvious. Sometimes she would wedge herself between us, her presence icy. Then came the mornings. Each time Henry and I spent the night together, I would find Abigail standing at the top of the basement stairs, silently glaring, her eyes full of reproach. One afternoon I had the house to myself. As I worked on my mural in the basement, a cold tension filled the air. Suddenly, a bottle of beer I had placed perfectly on the center of a speaker flew across the room, landing far from where it should have fallen. My heart raced. There was no logical explanation, no vibration strong enough to launch it that far. But I didn't have time to ponder. The shadows in the basement felt like they were closing in. I grabbed my things and left the basement, heart pounding. Later that night, as Henry and I lay in bed, I woke to him thrashing and mumbling in his sleep. He was sleepwalking, but it was as if something was guiding him. He moved up the stairs and down the hall to Abigail's room. He paused in the doorway, then slowly returned to bed. When he woke in the morning, his lips and tongue were stained black with paint. He swore Abigail had painted his face in a dream, but the black paint told a different story. The next night, the house was dark and eerily quiet. Lauren and I were the only ones home, and the tension was thick. As I lay in bed, my blankets began to slip off slowly, as if being pulled. I yanked them back up, my heart racing, but the covers slipped again. Then, in an instant, they were ripped from the bed. I scrambled upstairs, crashing into Lauren, both of us in a panic. We bolted into Abigail's room, expecting to find her awake, but she was fast asleep. Her blankets, however, were neatly on the floor, just like ours. Lauren and I spent the rest of the night on the couch, too terrified to return downstairs. The next day we armed ourselves with holy water and a plan to confront whatever was haunting the house. We set up a Ouija board in the living room, and as a shot glass moved on its own, the basement door creaked open. A low murmur, like distant voices, rose from the basement. Before we could react, the door slammed shut, as if warning us. It was then I knew. This wasn't just Abigail's trauma manifesting. There was something else in that house, something far more sinister. I packed my things and left that weekend, but the cold presence of those events has never left me. It was 1975 when my family, my mother, brother, sister, and brand new niece, moved into a seemingly quiet home in South Minneapolis. We were forced to relocate for my mother's health, as she needed a first-floor bedroom. What we didn't realize at the time was that the house was about to unveil a darker, more terrifying side. Shortly after moving in, my father, who had recently returned to help with expenses, built himself a room in the basement. Early on, strange things began to happen. My father, always awake at 3 or 4 a.m., claimed he heard a baby crying upstairs from my sister's room. The problem? The baby would be sound asleep, the house eerily silent save for that haunting cry. Then came the sightings. Twice my sister woke up in the dead of night to see a figure, a little girl standing by the crib, gazing down at her baby. Both times my sister dismissed it, thinking she was just imagining things, but the figure never left her mind. Years later, after my sister had moved out, my father stood in his usual spot by the front window, surveying the neighborhood. But on this morning, something was different. He glanced down beside him and saw the same little girl standing there, staring up at him with hollow, empty eyes. The moment he blinked, she vanished. From that point on, the crying from upstairs grew louder and more frequent, as if the house itself was mourning, but the real terror came when I took over the upstairs rooms. A friend moved into my old bedroom, and one night he returned with his girlfriend, visibly shaken. They had seen someone inside the upstairs window, boarding up the windows from the inside. I didn't believe them, but the tension grew every time I climbed the stairs. When I finally went to bed that night, my heart raced with every creak, but nothing was out of place. No boards, no signs of disturbance, just an overwhelming sense of being watched. It wasn't just us. My brother's girlfriend once came over for a family gathering. As she pulled up, she swore she saw a little girl waving at her from the upstairs window. The problem, there was no one upstairs. The most unsettling moment came a few years before my parents passed away. One day, my mother asked me to check a gift in the metal wardrobe in my old bedroom. I went to open it, but it was locked. The key was nowhere to be found after searching everywhere. I gave up until I felt something sharp under my foot. There, between the kitchen and the bedroom, was the key. In a place I had already walked past several times. The room had been freshly vacuumed. There was no way the key had been there. But the final experience left me shaken to my core. After my parents passed, my fiancée and I were cleaning up the house, preparing to leave. As we sat at the dining room table, I casually mentioned needing to turn off the hall light, a round old fluorescent bulb with a pull chain. An hour later, as we stood to leave, I looked into the hall and the light was off. Neither of us had moved the entire time. The chain hung still, untouched. A heavy, oppressive silence settled over us. We didn't stick around to investigate further. We left that house for good, but the feeling of being watched never left.